Hi, this is Professor Tiffany Martin with Medical Microbiology. We are in Chapter 1 and we are working our way through. We just talked about, defined what microbiology is, talked about Antony van Leeuwenhoek, which was the first person to see these microorganisms using these simple microscopes. So now let's kind of get into that time period, late 1700s into the 1800s, and seeing kind of what was going on and what things were happening during that time period. This is kind of described as time as the Golden Age of Microbiology. We had just learned that these organisms existed, and that became well known in the scientific community, and we were just, not understanding what they were and what they were doing. So in this time period, there were a lot of questions that the science community and anyone had during this time period. One was what causes diseases. Lots of diseases at that time, plagues coming through, smallpox coming through, typhoid, these diseases that would just wipe out people and whole villages, whole towns and cities. And so they didn't know what caused them, which means when you don't know what causes something, it's very difficult to understand how to prevent it. So this was a big question. And at the time period, anytime we have a question, our brains just try to fill in the blanks. So anytime we have a question, we try to fill in the blanks. And so that's what they kind of did at this point, which is what we do all the time. So what causes disease? There were a lot of different thoughts at that time. A lot of people, you can imagine that they thought witches, witchcraft, spirits, God, the devil, sin, all of these things cause disease. Being poor, cause diseases. Living in, in big cities could cause disease. Bad air causes disease. They had a lot of ideas of what caused disease, but it was very difficult to understand the specifics. And until you know the specifics, it's hard to prevent it. So that was a big deal going on at the time. Another question that was going on was fermentation. They had been making bread. They had been fermenting grapes into wine, into beer. They've been doing that for years, but centuries, but they didn't always know how it worked. They didn't know how it worked, so sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't work. And so again, until you understand something, it's hard to figure out how to make sure it works all the time. So that was a question going on, fermentation. And the other big question was the spontaneous generation of life. And that we kind of referred to in the other video with Antony van Leeuwenhoek, and I said he was an inadvertent supporter of spontaneous generation. So by this point in time, spontaneous generation, or abiogenesis, was put forth by Aristotle. So it had been around for a long time. Greek, that life could come from non-living matter. Now, by this point in time, they had figured out you need a mama cow and a daddy cow to get a baby cow. They kind of figured out that, but it was the other small organisms that was giving them trouble. A lot of scientists began to doubt spontaneous generation, that even these small organisms had to have a mom and a dad somewhere. And so this became spontaneous generation started being questioned during this time period. And again, it wasn't the cows that they were struggling with. It was you put flour in a pantry and then you come back in a week and there are bugs. Where'd those bugs come from? They weren't there when you put it in there. How did they get there? Spontaneous generation. It makes sense. Dry riverbank has been dry for a long time. Suddenly you get spring rains and the next day there's all these tadpoles and things swimming around. Where do they come from? Spontaneous generation. So see, some of that kind of made sense. So this was what was questionings were going on during this time period. So, all right, so, and then when we got to Antony van Leeuwenhoek and his view on microorganisms, well, those had to have come from spontaneous generation. Where else could they have come from? All right, so scientists, again, beginning to question this. And there was a scientist named Reddy living in the 1600s, so this was very early on in our timeline here, and he was doubting Aristotle's view of spontaneous generation, that maggots come from decaying meat. Maggots, a living thing, comes from a non-living thing, from meat. So he designed an experiment. Took some meat, left it in a container, left it open to the air, let it sit for a few days, took observations along the way, and sure enough, a few days later, he saw maggots appear on this meat. They also observed flies going around. So that was his control. So now he wanted to see if he sealed the flask, would the meat spontaneously produce maggots? Sure enough, as you can predict, given our current knowledge today, when he sealed this with a cork, no maggots came. So he said spontaneous generation does not occur. There were no flies, there were no maggots, spontaneous generation doesn't occur. Now, contemporaries of his were concerned because he cut out the air from this. So by sealing it with a cork, you also sealed out the air. And back then, air was pretty important, right? A baby would take its first breath of life, and the air would kind of breathe that life force into that. They kind of believed that air had a life force in it, which makes sense because we need air to breathe. So they're like, well, you took off the air, so whatever life force was giving it, that's why the maggots didn't appear. So Reddy covered it this time with a cheesecloth. It would allow the air in, but the flies that were buzzing around could not get in. So did the same experiment, allowed the air to come in. This time, still no maggots on the meat, but he did see the maggots on the cheesecloth. He did see the flies collecting on the cheesecloth. His conclusion was that spontaneous generation does not exist, and this is 1600s. Okay, all right, so again, Leeuwenhoek came, found all his little wee beasties swimming around, and now they're thinking, okay, but what about these? These have got to be spontaneously generated. So there was a British investigator called Needham, living a little bit later, 1700s, and he wanted to see what about these microorganisms. So his experiment, he took some vegetable matter, some plant material, had microorganisms in here, put it in a container, and he boiled it. So he boiled it and then he corked it. So he put a seal on this, and he wanted to see if these microorganisms could spontaneously generate. So took the plant matter, put it in some water, sealed it, boiled it, sealed it with a cork, and then observed it in a couple of days. What he saw was the water got cloudy. So 3 days of being sealed, after boiling, it got cloudy. He took a sample, he looked at it under with the microscope, and he found microorganisms, his wee beasties, Leeuwenhoek's wee beasties. His conclusion, spontaneous generation of microorganisms is possible. Okay, so to our ears, this still doesn't sound right to us. Can you think of some things that may have gone wrong with this experiment? And I'll let you think for a second for that. Okay, so things that could have gone wrong. He did boil it, which should get rid of microorganisms. He might not have boiled it long enough. He did seal it, but he sealed it with a cork. So there could have been microorganisms present on the cork. He may have contaminated it as he was sealing it. Either way, microorganisms could have come in contact with this, and then microorganisms would reproduce and he would get his results. All right, so those are some of our concerns with this experiment. Other scientists had the same concerns. There was another guy, he was an Italian gentleman named Scallanzani, physician in this time period, 1700s. He was looking at Needham's work, and he had the same questions we had. So this time he boiled it, but he boiled it for a long time. And he also, instead of using a cork, which we said might have brought in microorganisms, he sealed it by boiling it in a glass container and then taking the glass and blowing it, heating it and sealing it shut there. In this case, when he did that experiment, he did not get a cloudy liquid after a few days of observations, and his conclusion was spontaneous generation does not exist. That Needham either didn't boil it long enough or he contaminated it by using cork. All right, so Scallanzani says spontaneous generation does not exist. However, other scientists at the time said that, well, you sealed these glass containers by melting the glass and making sure it was shut. What else could not get in? That's right, you guessed it, air. So air could not get in. This life force that air brings could not get in. And so that's why spontaneous generation did not happen.